Sarah had exactly 3 seconds to decide: remain a ghost or become a savior for the most dangerous man in the city. As the heavy doors of the Golden Dragon swung open, the air itself seemed to die. Sung walked in with a heavy, rhythmic step that made the floorboards groan like a warning. Sarah gripped her tray until her knuckles turned the color of bone, her eyes fixed on the ink crawling up the boss's neck, a black dragon that seemed to breathe with every pulse of his throat. She was just an invisible waitress trying to pay her mother's medical bills, but tonight, silence was no longer an option. From the corner of her eye, she spotted a shadow by the kitchen door, a traitorous busboy with a silver ring tilted over Sung's vintage red wine. A single, lethal drop of clear liquid vanished into the deep crimson depths. One sip, and the dragon would fall. One move, and Sarah would be marked for death. As Sung reached for the glass, Sarah's heart thrashed like a caged bird. She took a breath, stepped into the light, and prepared to shatter her world forever. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 200 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Afro-Korean Drama Series, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Sarah moved through the Golden Dragon like a ghost, her feet silent on the thick carpet. To the rich men in the booths, she was just a pair of hands that cleared away empty plates and refilled water glasses. She liked it that way because being seen was dangerous, especially when you owed money to the kind of people who didn't take no for an answer. Every time she felt tired, she thought of the blue light of her mother's dialysis machine and the stacks of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. Those bills were a mountain that grew higher every night, and one wrong move would cause an avalanche that would bury them both. But tonight, the mountain felt like it was made of thin glass, ready to shatter under the heavy boots of the man sitting at table 12. Sung, the man they called the Black Dragon, sat perfectly still while the air around him seemed to freeze. He didn't look like a monster, but the way the other waiters stayed 10 feet away told Sarah everything she needed to know. The ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck looked like it was crawling toward his jaw, pulse by pulse. Sarah's knuckles turned the color of salt as she gripped her serving tray, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. A new busboy was walking toward the dragon's table, and he was carrying a bottle of vintage red wine like it was a holy relic. Sarah had never seen this boy before, but she saw the way his fingers trembled against the silver neck of the bottle. The busboy reached the table, and for a split second, the light caught a silver ring on his finger. Sarah watched, frozen, as the top of the ring clicked open and a single, heavy drop of clear liquid fell into the wine glass. It was a tiny thing, no bigger than a tear, but it hit the dark red liquid and vanished without a trace. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. She remembered her father's face the night the men in suits took him away, the same look of doomed silence that was about to claim Sung. If she stayed quiet, she was safe. If she spoke, she was a target. Sarah didn't shout, because a ghost doesn't have a voice. Instead, she threw her weight forward, her shoe catching the edge of a heavy oak chair. Her body tilted, and the world slowed down until she could see every bead of sweat on the busboy's forehead. She slammed into him with the force of a runaway car, her tray flying from her hands like a jagged metal wing. The expensive wine bottle hit the edge of the table and exploded, sending a spray of glass and crimson liquid everywhere. The deep red stain spread across Sung's white silk shirt like a fresh, wet wound. The silence that followed was heavier than the crash. Every diner in the restaurant stopped chewing, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The busboy turned a sickly shade of grey, his eyes wide and panicked as he looked from the broken glass to the man in the chair. Sarah stayed on the floor, her knees stinging as they pressed into the shards of glass. She didn't look at the mess. She looked straight at the busboy's shaking hands. Sung didn't jump up or shout. He simply sat there while the poisoned wine dripped from his sleeve onto the floor. "Clean it up," the busboy hissed, his voice cracking like dry wood. He stepped toward Sarah, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "I'm so sorry, sir," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking as she grabbed a white cloth. She didn't look at the busboy. She looked at the way the wine was eating into the fabric of Sung's expensive suit. Sung finally moved, reaching out a hand that was as steady as stone. He didn't grab the busboy. He wrapped his fingers around Sarah's wrist, his grip cold and tight. His eyes weren't looking at the red stain or the broken glass. They were staring into Sarah's soul, searching for the lie. He noticed that her hands hadn't started shaking until the bottle was already in pieces on the floor. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the scent of expensive cologne and cold rain filling her nose. "You're a very clumsy girl, Sarah," Sung said, his voice a low growl that made the hair on her arms stand up. He pulled her closer, forcing her to stand, never letting go of her wrist. But you weren't looking at the floor when you tripped. You were looking at the wine. Sarah felt the sting of a glass shard cutting into her palm, the copper taste of fear rising in her throat. She wanted to run, to go back to being a ghost, but the dragon's grip was a golden chain she couldn't break. Behind Sung, the busboy was slowly backing away toward the kitchen, his hand reaching for the exit. "Minute Ho," Sung called out without turning his head. A giant of a man appeared from the shadows, blocking the busboy's path. "Take the boy to the back. And bring the girl. I want to know why she decided to ruin my favorite shirt." Sarah looked at the manager, who was bowing so low his head nearly touched the ground, but he wouldn't help her. She was no longer a waitress. She was a piece of evidence in a war she didn't want to fight. As they led her toward the dark hallway behind the kitchen, she realized the mountain of debt was gone, replaced by something much scarier. She had saved the dragon, but the dragon was known for keeping the things he found. The heavy steel door of the back office clicked shut, locking out the sounds of the restaurant. Sung sat behind a large desk, the red stain on his chest looking like a target. He picked up a ceramic knife from the desk, the blade white and sharp as a tooth. He turned it over in his hands, the light reflecting off the edge. "Tell me the truth," Sung said, pointing the knife at the chair across from him. "Did you break that bottle to save me, or was it just your turn to try and kill me?" Sarah sat down, the leather of the chair feeling cold against her skin. She thought of her mother, alone in their small apartment, waiting for a daughter who might never come home. If she told him about the poison, she was part of his world forever. If she lied, he would use that knife to find the answer. The industrial freezer hummed like a hungry beast, vibrating through the soles of Sarah's shoes as Minute Ho shoved her onto a metal prep table. The cold of the stainless steel bit through her thin uniform, a cruel reminder of the night the police sat her on a frozen curb while they hauled her father away in zip ties. She didn't struggle against Ho's massive hands. She knew that for people like her, struggling only made the bruises darker. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the table, the metallic scent of raw meat and bleach filling her nose until she felt like she was gagging. Every breath was a jagged shard of ice in her chest, but she kept her eyes on the swinging door, waiting for the monster to enter. Sung stepped into the kitchen, his presence sucking the heat out of the room faster than the industrial fans. He didn't look like a man who had just been drenched in wine. He looked like an executioner who had just finished his morning prayers. He pulled a pristine silk handkerchief from his pocket and began to wipe the dark red stain from his cuff with a slow, rhythmic motion that made Sarah's pulse skip. His eyes, dark as oil, fixed on her face, searching for the crack in her porcelain mask that would reveal the traitor underneath. "You've worked here 3 years, Sarah," he said, his voice a low vibration that rattled the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. "You've never dropped a spoon, yet tonight you decided to play the part of a clumsy fool. Why?" Sarah's throat was a desert, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth like dry leather. She looked at the dragon tattoo on his neck, the black ink pulsing with every beat of his heavy heart, reminding her of the men who had promised to protect her father before they destroyed him. She knew that in this world, a lie was a death sentence, but the truth was a blood pact you could never sign your way out of. "The wine was bitter before it even touched your lips, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood under a heavy boot. She waited for him to strike her, but he only leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. Sung didn't blink, but his pupils narrowed until they were needle points of black ice. He didn't ask for a name or a motive. He simply raised a single finger, and Minute Ho vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Sarah's heart thrashed against her ribs, her skin crawling with the sudden realization that she had just traded a quiet life for a front-row seat to a murder. She wanted to look away, to hide in the memories of her mother's soft humming, but the cold weight of Sung's gaze held her pinned like a butterfly under glass. The silence in the kitchen became a physical pressure, a suffocating blanket that smelled of incoming rain and copper. The door swung open again, and Ho dragged the new busboy into the light, the boy's feet scuffing uselessly against the tile. The boy was shaking so hard his teeth were clicking together, a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. Sung reached down and picked up a stray glass from the counter, dipping it into a small puddle of the spilled red wine that had pooled on a silver tray. He held the glass out to the boy, his expression as calm as a deep-sea trench. "If the vintage is so fine, you shouldn't mind a taste," Sung murmured, the words smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor. The busboy's eyes bulged, his face turning a sickly shade of grey as he stared at the crimson liquid. He tried to shake his head, a choked plea dying in his throat, but Ho's hand clamped onto the back of his neck like a vice. Sarah watched, her stomach churning, as the glass was forced against the boy's lips, the wine spilling down his chin like a bloody grin. She wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, but the memory of her own helplessness when her family's home was seized kept her frozen. She realized then that Sung wasn't just testing the wine. He was testing her loyalty to the silence she had lived in for 24 years. The boy took a single, forced swallow before his body went rigid, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to catch a ghost. He didn't scream, he simply collapsed, his head hitting the tile with a sickening thud that echoed through the empty kitchen. His legs gave one final, violent jerk before he went still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling in a sightless stare. Sarah's world tilted on its axis, the taste of salt and iron filling her mouth as she realized she had just witnessed an execution. She wasn't an invisible waitress anymore. She was a witness to a crime that the law would never touch. Sung didn't look at the body. He looked at Sarah, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He tossed the silk handkerchief onto the boy's chest and took a step toward her, his boots clicking rhythmically on the blood-stained tile. "You have a good eye, Sarah," he said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear with a touch that made her skin burn. "And in my world, a good eye is a valuable weapon." He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear, whispering a promise that felt more like a threat. "You saved the dragon's life tonight," he murmured, his grip tightening on her arm until she felt the bone groan. "But now you belong to the dragon, and the people who sent that boy are going to want to know why you stood in their way." The smell of burnt plastic and old memories choked the street, thick enough to coat Sarah's tongue in a layer of bitter soot. She stood on the sidewalk, her uniform still damp with poisoned wine, watching the orange tongues of fire lick the windows of the only home she had left. The red flashing lights of the fire trucks danced across the empty medicine bottles melted on the pavement, the very ones her mother needed to breathe. 10 years ago, she had watched the bank men carry out her father's desk. Tonight, the fire had taken the last of his photographs. Every flicker of the flame felt like a claw stripping away her skin, leaving her raw and exposed to the cold city air. Behind her, the hiss of hydraulic brakes cut through the roar of the fire, signaling a predator that didn't need fire to destroy a life. A black sedan, sleek and silent as a shark in dark water, glided to a halt at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the destruction of her world. The back window rolled down with a mechanical hum, revealing Sung's profile, sharp and jagged against the velvet interior. He didn't look at the burning building. He looked at the way Sarah's knees were beginning to buckle. "The fire didn't start in the kitchen, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum that cut through the sirens. "It started the moment you broke that bottle." Sarah's fingers curled into her palms until her nails drew blood, the stinging pain the only thing keeping her upright. "My mother was inside," she whispered, her voice a ragged ghost of itself, her eyes searching the smoke for a miracle that wasn't coming. She expected a word of comfort, a lie to soothe the burn, but Sung only tilted his head toward the leather seat. "She's safe, for now," he countered, his words a sharp blade that cut her hope in half. "But the men who lit this match are currently looking for the girl who made them fail." She stepped toward the car, her legs heavy as if wading through deep mud, the heat from the building pushing her toward the cold sanctuary of the sedan. As she slid onto the seat, the smell of expensive leather replaced the scent of smoke, but the air inside felt even thinner. Sung didn't offer her a hand. He simply signaled the driver, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the skeleton of her life behind. Sarah looked back at the dying embers, realizing she had traded a burning cage for one made of polished chrome. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice steadying into a hard, cold edge that surprised even her. Sung reached into a small mahogany compartment and pulled out a tablet, the screen glowing with a blueprint of the Golden Dragon security network. "Betrayal is a disease that starts at the heart," he murmured, his thumb tracing a line toward the name Director Park. "My right hand has decided he no longer needs a body to serve." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She knew Director Park as the man who tipped her with $100 bills while asking about her mother's health. He wasn't just a traitor. He was the architect of the very system that had crushed her father. The car took a sharp turn, throwing Sarah against the door as the city lights blurred into long, neon streaks. "I'm just a waitress," she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. "I have no part in your war." Sung leaned over, his dragon tattoo appearing to move in the flickering light of the street lamps, his face inches from hers. "You stopped a bullet with a wine glass," he hissed, the scent of rain and iron clinging to him. "In their eyes, you are the only reason I am still breathing, which makes you the most dangerous target in the city." Sarah looked out the window and saw a dark SUV trailing them, its headlights turned off, a shadow following a shadow. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Sung hadn't picked her up to protect her, he had picked her up to use her as bait. Every turn the driver made was a calculation, a move on a chessboard where she was the pawn meant to be sacrificed. Her chest tightened, her lungs screaming for the oxygen the fire had stolen, as she realized the man beside her was more dangerous than the flames. "Why me?" she gasped, her voice small against the hum of the engine. Sung didn't answer immediately. He watched the dark SUV in the rearview mirror, his hand moving to the heavy holster beneath his coat. "Because you have nothing left to lose," he finally said, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory gleam. "And people with nothing left are the only ones who can't be bought." The driver slammed on the brakes as a second SUV swerved in front of them, blocking the bridge that led out of the district. Sarah's head jerked forward, the seatbelt biting into her shoulder as she saw the glint of steel barrels protruding from the enemy windows. The bridge was a trap, the water below a dark grave waiting for them both. Sung didn't panic. He reached across her, his arm a heavy bar of muscle, and pulled a compact submachine gun from the door panel. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a cold anchor in the rising storm of her terror. As the first window of their sedan shattered into 1,000 diamond-like shards, Sarah realized the fire was just the beginning. The dragon wasn't saving her life. He was drafting her into his death. The penthouse elevator opened with a sound like a guillotine blade sliding home, depositing Sarah into a tomb of white marble and glass. Every surface was too clean, too sharp, reflecting the jagged edges of a woman who had lost her home and her name in the same hour. She stepped onto the silk rug, her bare toes sinking into the fibers, but the luxury felt like a trap designed to muffle her screams. On the glass coffee table sat a stack of envelopes, each one stamped with the red seal of the city hospital and a bold, black paid that seemed to bleed into the paper. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the documents that represented 10 years of her mother's suffering, erased by a man's casual signature. She had spent a decade drowning in interest rates and late fees, and Sung had bought her freedom with the pocket change of a criminal. But as she flipped the last page, she saw the fine print. Her mother wasn't in a public ward anymore, but a private facility owned by one of Sung's ghost companies. The weight of the gift settled in her stomach like a bag of wet stones, dragging her toward the floor. She wasn't a waitress or a witness. She was a line item on a ledger, a piece of property tucked away in a high-altitude vault. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below looking like a circuit board of neon lights and dark alleyways where people like her father went to disappear. She remembered the day the debt collectors took the family car, her father standing on the lawn with his shoulders slumped, a broken man who couldn't protect his own. Every bill Sung paid was a slap to her father's memory, a reminder that the only way to survive the wolves was to become the collar around one's neck. She pushed open the heavy glass door to the balcony, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face like a lash. Sung was leaning against the stone railing, the orange glow of a cigarette illuminating the hard lines of a face that had forgotten how to rest. He didn't turn around, but the dragon on his neck seemed to shift as he took a long, slow drag of the smoke. "The air is thin up here, Sarah," he murmured, the sound of her name in his mouth feeling like a cold hand on her throat. Most people find it hard to breathe when they realize how high they've fallen. He turned, his eyes searching hers for the fear he expected to find, but he only saw the reflection of the burning city. He looked at the silk robe she wore, a garment that cost more than her father's entire life, and a flicker of something that looked like regret crossed his features. "Why save me?" he asked, the question hitting her like a physical blow, his voice dropping an octave until it vibrated in the stone beneath her feet. "I've spent 20 years making sure people like you stay under my boot. I am the monster your father told you to hide from." Sarah stepped closer, the cold stone of the balcony floor numbing her feet, her voice coming out steady and sharp as a needle. "My father didn't die because of monsters," she said, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the railing. "He died because he was a good man who believed the world was fair, and the world ate him alive for it." She looked past Sung, toward the dark patch of the city where her apartment was still smoldering, a black hole in the neon grid. "I didn't save a boss tonight, and I didn't save a dragon. I saved a person who was about to die in the dark, just like he did." Sung flicked the cigarette into the abyss, his eyes narrowing until they were slits of dark glass. "A person," he spat, the word a weapon designed to draw blood. "There are no people in this building, Sarah. There are only targets and the ones who hit them." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, the heat from his skin radiating against her cheek like a furnace. For a second, she thought he might strike her, to prove he was as hollow as he claimed, but his thumb merely brushed a smudge of soot from her jawline. The touch was too gentle, a subversion that made her skin crawl with a new kind of danger. "I thought maybe, if I saved one," she continued, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the wound beneath, "I could stop being afraid of the rest." She looked at him then, truly looking at the man behind the tattoo, seeing the exhaustion that no amount of money could fix. She wanted to believe her act of mercy had bought her a seat at the table, but the way Sung's gaze shifted to the door reminded her she was still the bait. The moment of connection was a thin bridge over deep canyon, and the wind was picking up. "A pretty thought," Sung whispered, his hand dropping back to his side as he looked over her shoulder. "But fear is the only thing that keeps you alive in this house." He stepped past her, heading back into the sterile white light of the penthouse, leaving her alone in the cold. As the door slid shut, the lock clicked with a finality that echoed in her chest. She turned back to the city, but the dark SUV from the bridge wasn't gone. It was parked 3 blocks away, its lights off, waiting for the dragon to sleep. The steam from the boiling pot of noodles rose like a white flag between them, softening the sharp edges of the stainless steel kitchen. Sarah's hands, once accustomed to carrying heavy trays for strangers, now guided Sung's calloused fingers as he chopped garlic with the precision of a man dismantling a bomb. She watched the ink of the black dragon on his neck flex as he worked, no longer a warning of death but a rhythmic pulse of a man trying to learn how to live. "My mother always said the secret isn't the spice, it's the patience," she whispered, her voice a fragile bridge over the silence that usually filled the penthouse. For a heartbeat, the monster who ruled the city's shadows looked like a boy at a hearth, the smell of toasted sesame oil replacing the metallic scent of gunpowder. But as he looked at her, his eyes didn't just see a teacher. They saw a shield he was starting to forget he needed. Later that night, the kitchen warmth was replaced by the clinical chill of the private training room, where the air tasted of ozone and sweat. Sung stood behind her, his chest a solid wall against her back, his hand guiding hers as she gripped a slender ceramic blade. "Steel is loud, Sarah. It sings when it hits bone," he murmured, his breath a hot ghost against her ear that made her skin prickle. "Ceramic is silent, like a secret told in the dark." He pushed her arm forward, showing her the exact point beneath a man's ribs where a heart can be stopped before it even knows it's under attack. She leaned into him, the strength of his frame offering a safety her father had never been able to provide, but as she stepped forward to strike the dummy, a sudden, jagged pain ripped through her chest. The world didn't just blur, it dissolved into a sea of static and grey. Sarah didn't fall so much as she crumbled, her knees hitting the mats with a sound like snapping dry wood, the white blade clattering away. The taste of copper flooded her mouth, and her vision narrowed until the only thing left was the black ink of the dragon hovering over her. She tried to draw a breath, but her lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand, her heart thrashing against her ribs like a dying bird in a cage. Sung's face, usually a mask of stone, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of panic as he scooped her up, his roar for minute ho echoing off the walls. The last thing she felt was the vibration of his chest against hers, a terrifyingly strong beat that her own body was no longer able to match. When the world returned, it was made of fluorescent lights that burned like needles and the rhythmic, mocking beep of a heart monitor. Sarah lay in a bed that felt too soft, her skin the color of old ash, a spiderweb of wires connecting her to a machine that was doing the work her body refused to do. Across the room, a doctor stood with a tablet, his face a map of bad news and expensive pity. "It's the same defect that took your father, Sarah," he said, his voice a flat, mechanical drone that made the room feel even colder. "The stress, the adrenaline of the last month, it's acted like a catalyst, stretching the muscle until it's ready to tear." He looked at the readings, his eyes refusing to meet hers as he delivered the final blow, 90 days, if you're careful, significantly less if you're not. Sarah looked through the heavy glass partition where Sung was pacing the hallway, a phone pressed to his ear, his jaw set in a line that usually meant someone was about to die. He looked like the monster again, the man who moved mountains and broke empires, and the sight of him made her chest ache with a physical weight that had nothing to do with her heart. She remembered her father's final days, the way the light had left his eyes when he realized he was leaving his family with nothing but a legacy of debt. She couldn't do that to Sung. She couldn't be another debt he couldn't pay, another ghost in his hallway. She reached out and grabbed the doctor's wrist, her grip surprisingly fierce for a woman whose life was leaking out of her. "Don't tell him," she whispered, the words coming out as a ragged, desperate plea that tasted of salt and iron. The doctor hesitated, his gaze shifting to the powerful man outside who could likely have the hospital leveled with a single phone call. "He's spent his entire life in a war that never ends, and I am the only piece of peace he has ever found," she continued, her knuckles turning white as she pulled the doctor closer. "Let him have this one victory. Let him believe he saved me." As Sung finished his call and turned toward the glass, his eyes searching for her with a raw, terrifying hope, Sarah forced her lips into a weak, deceptive smile. She had saved the dragon from a drop of poison, but she was now carrying a toxin in her blood that no blade could cut out. The bedside table groaned under the weight of prescription bottles that Sarah hid behind a bouquet of white lilies, their sweet, heavy scent fighting the metallic tang of her medicine. Every morning felt like waking up in a house made of dry leaves, where a single deep breath might cause her ribs to cave in. She didn't spend her time resting. She spent it memorizing Sung, tracing the jagged geography of the scars on his back as if they were a map to a world she wouldn't see. She kissed him with a desperate, frantic hunger, her lips pressing against his pulse point as if she could steal the rhythm of his healthy heart to jumpstart her failing one. He was a man who had built a life on secrets, yet he couldn't see the one growing like a shadow inside her chest. But as she leaned her head against his shoulder, her ears caught the faint, rhythmic ticking of a device in his pocket that wasn't a watch. "You're breathing too fast, Sarah," Sung murmured, his voice a low vibration that made her sternum ache, his hand coming up to cup her jaw with terrifying gentleness. He didn't look at her with the cold eyes of a boss anymore. He looked at her like a man staring at a masterpiece he knew he didn't deserve. Sarah forced a laugh, a dry, brittle sound that felt like sandpaper in her throat, and leaned into the heat of his skin. She had spent her childhood watching her father hide his coughs behind a handkerchief, and now she was a master of the same deadly theater. Every smile she gave him was a brick in a wall she was building to keep him out of her tragedy, but the wall was beginning to sweat. Sung pulled back, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a single, dark bruise on her arm where the nurse had struggled to find a vein. "The hospital said your blood work was clear, yet you look like you're fading into the wallpaper," Sung stated, his words no longer a question but an indictment. He stood up, the black dragon on his neck appearing to darken as he paced the length of the room, a predator sensing a scent he couldn't identify. Sarah gripped the silk sheets until her knuckles were the color of bone, the physical effort of sitting upright feeling like she was lifting a mountain. She had won another day of his ignorance, but the cost was a growing distance that felt like an ocean between them. Before she could answer, the heavy oak door to the suite burst open, and Minute Ho stood there, his face a mask of sweating stone. "Director Park has made his move," Ho rasped, holding out a burner phone that was vibrating with a video feed. Sung snatched the device, and Sarah felt the air leave the room as if a vacuum had been turned on, her lungs burning for oxygen that wouldn't come. She dragged herself to the edge of the bed, her vision tunneling as she peered at the small, grainy screen. It wasn't a warehouse or a dock. It was a sterile, white room with a single chair and a dialysis machine humming in the corner. Her mother sat there, her eyes clouded with confusion, while a man in a sharp grey suit adjusted the flow of the four-line with a gloved hand. The victory of the hospital bills was gone, replaced by a new, more intimate form of slavery. "He didn't take her to a basement, Sung," Sarah whispered, her voice a thin wire that threatened to snap under the weight of the image. "He took her to a clinic." She saw the way Director Park smiled at the camera, a polite, boardroom smile that made her want to claw her own eyes out. He wasn't just holding her mother hostage, he was holding her life support, his thumb hovering over the stop button on the machine that kept her blood clean. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs were water, her heart skipping beats like a broken record as she realized the cruel irony. She had hidden her own death from Sung to give him peace, and now the enemy was using her mother's life to start a war. Sung's hand crushed the phone in a grip that sent shards of plastic biting into his palm, but he didn't let out a sound. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time, she saw the monster return in full force, the cold, calculating dragon that didn't know the meaning of mercy. "He wants a trade," Sung said, his voice a jagged edge of ice that cut through the lily's scent. "He wants the girl who saved me, delivered to the golden dragon by midnight, or the machine stops." Sarah looked at the clock, the red numbers ticking down with a mechanical indifference that mimicked her own fading pulse. She had less than 3 months to live, but Park was giving her less than 3 hours to choose who died first. "I'll go," Sarah said, the words tasting of copper and salt as she forced herself to stand, her hands shaking so violently she had to hide them in the folds of her robe. Sung grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin, his face a mask of fury and something that looked dangerously like grief. "You are not a pawn, Sarah," he hissed, the dragon on his neck pulsing with a life of its own. But as he looked into her graying face, he saw the truth she had been trying so hard to hide, the truth that she was already leaving him, one heartbeat at a time. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the scent of the lilies turned from sweet to funeral cold. The heavy iron scent of the golden dragon's kitchen didn't smell like ginger or garlic anymore. It smelled like the wet stone of a tomb. Sarah squeezed through the narrow service duct, the galvanized steel scraping against her spine like a serrated knife. Every movement cost a gallon of sweat, her heart thumping against her ribs with a hollow, wet sound that reminded her of a drum muffled by dirt. She remembered the day the landlord locked the door to their old house, her father begging through the wood while she hid in the crawl space, too small to help, too scared to breathe. Tonight, the crawl space was her weapon, but the heat in her chest was a fire she couldn't outrun. Below her, the muffled voice of Director Park cut through the vents, cold and sharp as a bone saw. Sung stood in the center of the dining room, the crystal chandeliers reflecting in his eyes like shards of ice. He looked smaller under the spotlights, a lone target surrounded by a circle of men with suppressed pistols. Director Park sat at table 12, the very spot where the poison had first touched the air, casually swirling a glass of wine that looked like spilled blood. "The dragon without his teeth is just a lizard, Sung," Park sneered, gesturing to the corner where Sarah's mother was strapped into a transportable dialysis chair. The machine's rhythmic clicking was the only clock that mattered, a countdown that Park's thumb controlled via a small remote on the tablecloth. Sung didn't reach for a gun, he reached for a pen, his hand steady even as the black dragon on his neck seemed to choke him. Sarah reached the grate directly above the medical equipment, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps that tasted of iron. She could see the top of her mother's head, the thin grey hair damp with terror, and the sight fueled a desperate strength that her failing heart shouldn't have possessed. She unscrewed the final bolt with fingers that were numb and white at the tips, the metal clicking softly against her wedding ring, the one Sung had given her in the dark. She was ready to fall, ready to be the shield she was born to be, but then she saw the glint of a red laser dot dancing across her mother's temple. It wasn't just Park at the table. There was a sniper in the mezzanine, and Sung was walking straight into the crosshairs. "Sign the transfer, and they live long enough to see the sunrise," Park commanded, tossing a leather-bound folder onto the blood-stained carpet. Sung picked it up, his eyes flicking toward the ceiling for a microsecond, a silent signal that Sarah caught like a spark in the dark. He wasn't giving up. He was buying her the 3 seconds she had used to save him the first time. As his pen touched the paper, the sound of the scratching nib was the only warning. Sarah kicked the grate out, the heavy metal hitting the floor with a deafening clang that shattered the tension like a hammer on glass. She dropped from the dark maw of the vent, her body a weight of silk and desperation, landing squarely between her mother and the circle of steel. The room exploded into a chaotic symphony of muzzle flashes and shattering porcelain. Sarah wrapped her arms around the dialysis chair, her body acting as a human wall, the sound of bullets thudding into the heavy upholstery inches from her ear. She felt the searing heat of a graze along her shoulder, but the pain was a distant ghost compared to the agony screaming in her chest. Sung flipped the heavy oak table, the wood splinters flying like shrapnel as he pulled a hidden ceramic blade from his sleeve. He moved like a shadow through the smoke, a blur of motion that ended with the first of Park's men clutching a throat that was no longer there. But as Sarah looked up, she saw Park lunging for her mother's machine, his hand closing around the main power line. "If I lose the Empire, you lose the heart." Park screamed, his face twisted into a mask of pure, jagged hate. He yanked the cord, the green light on the dialysis machine flickering to a dead, silent black. Sarah's mother let out a soft, wheezing gasp, her eyes rolling back as the blood stopped moving through the filters. Sarah lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the tile, but her own heart gave a sickening, final lurch that sent her crashing to her knees. She was inches away from the plug, her hand outstretched, but her vision was turning into a sea of red static. Through the haze, she saw Sung standing over Park, his blade raised, but he was too far away to help her mother. Every muscle in Sarah's body felt like it was being pulled apart by horses, the copper taste of her own life filling her mouth. She remembered her father's hand slipping from hers at the hospital, the coldness of his skin a lesson she had never forgotten. She wouldn't let the cold take her mother, not while she still had one more beat left in her chest. She threw her entire weight forward, her fingers brushing the plastic casing of the plug just as a second wave of gunmen burst through the front doors. They weren't wearing Park's colors, but the silence they brought was even more terrifying. The dining room of the Golden Dragon became a hurricane of lead and bone, the air vibrating with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy-caliber rounds chewing through marble pillars. Sarah crawled across the floor, her vision flickering like a dying bulb, the smell of cordite and spilled soy sauce stinging her nostrils. Every jolt of the floorboard sent a fresh wave of agony through her chest, a reminder that her heart was a ticking bomb with a shortened fuse. She saw Sung rise from the wreckage of a table, his silhouette framed by the orange bloom of a muzzle flash, his eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her peace. But as he lunged forward, the second wave of gunmen didn't aim for him. They aimed for the supports of the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly over Sarah's mother. Sung didn't look back, He was a storm of blades and fury, his ceramic knife carving a path toward Director Park, who stood trembling behind the safety of a reinforced podium. Sarah saw the trap a second before the steel cable snapped. The heavy crystal beast began its descent, 1,000 pounds of glass ready to crush everything beneath it. With a scream that tore at her dry throat, Sarah threw herself at her mother's chair, the wheels screeching against the tile as she shoved the old woman into the narrow safety of the kitchen alcove. The chandelier hit the floor with a sound like a collapsing mountain, the shards flying outward like diamond shrapnel, one slicing a deep red line across Sarah's cheek. She had saved her mother, but the path between her and Sung was now a jagged wall of broken glass and fire. Director Park scrambled over the debris, his face a distorted mask of sweat and desperation, his right hand slipping into the silk lining of his sleeve. Sung reached him, his hand closing around Park's throat with the strength of a closing trap, but the older man didn't fight back. He smiled, a bloody, hideous grin that revealed a glint of steel hidden against his wrist. Sarah saw the needle, a slender, hollow fang filled with the same murky toxin that had almost claimed the dragon on the first night. She remembered her father's funeral, the way the coffin lid had closed with a final, hollow clunk, and the thought of Sung being silenced by that same darkness gave her a final, impossible burst of energy. She didn't run. She launched herself through the air, her failing heart giving one massive, agonizing kick that propelled her into the line of fire. The needle didn't hit Sung's neck. It buried itself deep into Sarah's shoulder, the cold liquid fire of the poison racing through her veins instantly. She felt her muscles go slack, her nervous system shutting down as the toxin met the weakness of her heart in a deadly chemical handshake. Sung's eyes widened, the rage in them replaced by a raw, jagged terror that she had never seen on a man of his stature. He didn't wait for Park to speak. He drove his blade home with a sickening, wet crunch, ending the traitor's life before the man could even witness his victory. As Park's body hit the floor, Sung turned, his arms catching Sarah just as her knees turned to water. No, 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 Sung breathed, the sound a ragged sob that shook his entire frame, his knuckles white as he pressed his hand against her wound as if he could squeeze the poison out. The restaurant was falling silent, the last of the gunmen fleeing into the night, but the quiet was more terrifying than the gunfire. Sarah looked up at him, her vision fading into a soft, hazy grey, the black dragon on his neck the only thing she could still see clearly. She wanted to tell him that it was okay, that her heart was already a broken thing, but her tongue felt like a lead weight in her mouth. She could feel the poison slowing her pulse to a crawl, each beat a heavy, echoed thud that felt further and further away. Sung pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, his tears hot and salty as they fell onto her cold skin. "I've got you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking like a splintering board. "I've got you, please, stay with me, I have the doctors, I have the medicine, I can fix this." He looked around the ruined room, a king of a palace made of glass and blood, realizing that all his power couldn't buy a single extra minute of her life. He pulled her into his lap, his body shielding her from the cold draft blowing through the shattered windows, but the warmth was leaving her fingers. The lights of the golden dragon flickered one last time before dying, leaving them in the dim, red glow of the emergency exits. Sarah reached up, her hand shaking as she brushed his cheek, her touch as light as a falling leaf. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, but in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city, she had never felt more alive. But as the darkness pressed in, she realized the poison wasn't just in her shoulder. It was in the air, a final gift from Park that was only just beginning to take effect. The sirens in the distance sounded like a funeral dirge, but inside the ruins of the Golden Dragon, the only sound was the wet, shallow rattle in Sarah's chest. The poison was a cold tide rising from her shoulder, meeting the slow, stuttering rhythm of her failing heart in a final, quiet collision. She looked up at the ceiling where she had once been a ghost in the vents, realizing the shadows were finally reaching out to claim her. "The poison, it's okay," she whispered, the words coming out as a thin mist of copper and salt, her fingers grazing the black ink on Sung's neck. She saw the raw, jagged hole in his soul where his pride used to be, and she realized her father's death had finally been paid for with a different kind of currency. But as her vision began to fray at the edges, she felt Sung's grip tighten until it was the only thing keeping her soul from drifting out the shattered windows. Sung's face was a map of wreckage, his tears washing clean tracks through the soot and blood on his cheeks as he rocked her back and forth. "I'll find a donor, I'll buy the hospital, I'll burn this city down until I find a cure," he roared, his voice cracking like a bone snapping in the dark. He reached into his coat, pulling out a handful of high-denomination bills as if the paper could patch the hole in her life, his knuckles white with a useless, frantic power. He had spent his life believing that everything had a price, but the silence growing in Sarah's eyes was a debt that no amount of gold could settle. He looked toward the door, waiting for the medics he had summoned, but the red emergency lights only revealed the empty hallway and the finality of the trap. It was going to happen anyway. Sung, Sarah murmured, her heart giving a slow, heavy thump that felt like a door closing in a distant room. My heart. It was already too full for this world. She remembered the blue light of the dialysis machine and the way her mother had looked at her earlier, a look of peace she hadn't seen in a decade. She had traded her 90 days for his forever, a bargain her father would have understood, a sacrifice that turned her from a victim into the architect of her own end. She watched the way Sung's eyes crinkled in agony, the rare sound of his laugh now replaced by a sob that shook the floorboards beneath them. The man who had been a monster was now just a boy crying over a broken toy, and she was the only one who could give him the mercy of a graceful exit. Then use it, she said, her voice a fragile thread that pulled him down until his ear was inches from her lips, the scent of white lilies and gunpowder thick in the air. Don't be the dragon anymore. Be the man I made noodles for. She forced her lips into a weak, deceptive smile, the same one she had used to hide her illness, but this time it was a gift, not a lie. She wanted him to remember the steam in the kitchen, not the blood on the tile, the taste of sesame oil instead of the bitter copper of the needle. She felt his forehead rest against hers, a final connection that felt like a bridge to a place she couldn't take him. The lights of the city outside began to blur into a single, shimmering sea of white, the pain in her chest finally dissolving into a soft, numb weightlessness. Sarah let out a long, slow breath, her hand slipping from his cheek and falling to the floor with a soft thud that echoed louder than any gunshot. She died in the center of the room where she had spent 3 years trying to be a shadow, finally illuminated by the glow of the only man who had ever truly seen her. Sung didn't scream. He simply held her, his body a silent monument of grief in the middle of a palace made of glass. The medics finally burst through the doors, their flashlights cutting through the dark, but they stopped when they saw the dragon kneeling in the ruins of his own heart. The golden sign of the restaurant had been melted down and replaced by brushed steel letters that caught the morning sun, the Lynn Medical Center for Cardiac Excellence. Sung stood on the pavement where the black sedan used to idle, but today there were no armed guards, only a line of nurses in crisp blue scrubs. He wore a simple wool coat, the heavy silk suits of his past buried in a vault alongside the ceramic blades and the ledgers of blood. His hands, once stained with the permanent scent of gunpowder, now carried a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors that felt heavier than any weapon he had ever wielded. He looked at the ribbon, a thin strip of crimson that reminded him of the wine spilled a year ago, and his knuckles turned the color of salt. He had dismantled an empire to pay for this foundation, selling every dock and warehouse to ensure that no daughter would ever have to choose between a ghost and a savior again. But as he prepared to cut the silk, a small girl in a hospital gown tugged at his sleeve, her face a pale reflection of the girl he had lost. "Are you the man who makes the hearts go again?" she asked, her voice a fragile chime that made the black dragon on Sung's neck feel like it was tightening. He knelt on the cold stone, the sharp snap of his joints echoing in the silence of the gathered crowd, and looked into her eyes. He saw the same resilient fear that had defined Sarah, the same spark of hope that the world had tried to extinguish. "I'm just the man who keeps the lights on," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that lacked its old edge of ice. He handed her a small piece of the red ribbon, a trophy of a victory he had bought with a price he could never repay. But as the crowd began to cheer, the shadow of Minute Ho appeared at the edge of the plaza, his face tight with a news that didn't belong in the sunlight. The Sunday sun hung low over the cemetery, casting long, purple shadows across the marble headstones that marched toward the horizon. Sung sat on the grass beside a plot of fresh clover, the thermal bag beside him releasing the spicy, toasted scent of sesame oil and handmade noodles. He laid a single white carnation atop the name Sarah Lynn, the petals looking like drops of milk against the dark stone. He had spent a lifetime taking what he wanted, but here, in the quiet company of the dead, he finally understood that the only things you truly keep are the things you give away. He heard the soft click-clack of a walker and looked up to see Sarah's mother, her cheeks full and her eyes bright with a health that had cost a girl her final 90 days. She sat beside him, opening a small, tattered notebook filled with Sarah's handwriting, recipes, reminders to take her pills, and a single page titled How to Tame a Dragon. "She knew," the old woman whispered, her voice steady and clear, her hand resting on the notebook as if it were a living thing. "She knew you were worth the heart she gave you." Sung looked at the sunrise, the sky bleeding into shades of plum and gold that matched the scarf Sarah used to wear to hide his marks. He had been a monster who ruled through fear, a predator who thought invisibility was a weakness, but a waitress had taught him that the greatest power was being seen. He reached out and touched the stone, the cold granite grounding him as the last of the dragon's fire died out in his chest. He wasn't the boss of the city anymore, And he wasn't the shield. He was simply a man who finally knew the weight of a promise. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the white lilies from the hospital opening toward the quiet hills of the grave. Sung stood up, helping the old woman to her feet, his movements slow and deliberate as if he were carrying a glass bottle that could shatter at any moment. He looked back at the city, the neon lights beginning to flicker on in the distance, a grid of lives that he was no longer interested in crushing. He realized then that the darkness would always be there, waiting at the edge of the glass, but it didn't have to win. He looked at the white flower on the grave one last time and walked toward the car, a bittersweet smile finally breaking the stone of his face.